Welcome to this webinar on Sea Change, Building Coastal Community Resilience in Aotearoa. So today we have two presenters, one from Tonkin Taylor, Bapon Fakhruddin, and then we have Melanie Hutton, who's the Head of Resilience, Community and Business, Auckland Emergency Management for Tamaki Makaurau. I'm Emily Riddell, the Membership Engagement Manager, and this webinar has been organised by IPW EANZ. We're really pleased to bring you this very timely and relevant topic. I'm just going to do a brief introduction to our organisation and then to the presenters for today. There'll be people who continue to join this webinar, and you will be muted when you join. So if you want to ask a question, then you'll have to unmute yourself, and do feel free to pop any questions that come up during the session into the chat dialogue, and we will go through those at the end. The session today is an hour long. The presentation will be 45 minutes, and then we'll have 15 minutes for Q&A at the end. So, I'll get my slides. So who is the Institute of Public Works Engineering Australasia? We are New Zealand's membership association for infrastructure, asset management and public works engineers. Our vision is sustainable communities enabled by public asset management excellence, and that's where this particular webinar topic is really pertinent to us. So climate change and coastal resilience is really important to everyone in our island nation. So without any further ado, I'll introduce our presenters. So today we've got Melanie Hutton from Tamaki Makaurau, currently at level 3. She has global experience in developing policies, strategies and delivering successful sustainability and community resilience building projects, which sound fascinating. I can't wait to hear more. Her key areas of expertise are in climate change mitigation and adaptation and environmental sustainability initiatives using community engagement and empowerment approaches. She has a range of experience both in New Zealand and overseas, and from the government perspective as well as private sector. She's been the New Zealand government's lead at the United Nations for greenhouse gas emissions to the international aviation and maritime sectors, and has led the environmental negotiations at the Antarctic Treaty negotiations. And for the last 5 years, Melanie has helped transform the civil defence approach of engaging and empowering Tamaki Makaurau communities facing the challenges of climate impact and other disasters. It sounds like a very busy role. And our other presenter today, so we've got the social side with Melanie and the social engagement, and then Bapon Fakhruddin, and he's from Tonkin Taylor. He's a technical director, DDR and climate resilience. So his most high-profile work is evidenced in the development of multi-hazard warning systems. Sounds fascinating, including a tsunami warning system delivered for Indian Ocean countries following the deadly 2004 Boxing Day tsunami. He has since designed and helped to implement climate change and disaster risk projects for more than 25 countries across Asia and the Pacific. He's played a pivotal role in the design and implementation of multi-hazard early warning systems for floods, cyclones and tsunami, critical to saving lives and livelihoods while reducing property damage. I can't wait to hear what both of them have to present to us today. So without any further ado, I'll hand over to you, Melanie.
Thank you very much. Well, kia ora koutou people, it's my pleasure to be speaking to you today. My talk is going to be very much from that social lens and looking at the work that we do with coastal communities to build their disaster resilience. And it's very much, to a degree, my insights around the work using the frameworks and approaches of the resilience team in Auckland Emergency Management. So this is our whakatauki that we use, toia te haumatia, kia rite, kia mau. And this underpins all of our resilience work, both in business and in communities. And I think at the heart of any effective community response to a coastal emergency is actually getting that plan and being connected in order to take action. So the things that I'm going to talk to you today, there's 5 things. Just overlooking what our strategies and plans are that help shape the conversations that we have. Looking at our community resilience, our vision that we have for our engagement. Looking at some of the approaches that we use, some of those tools in our kite which help us get the most out of the engagement that we have. And then I'll dive down into some of the coastal communities that we've worked with and just give a bit of a very light skim over of the challenges and the opportunities and the successes and the not so successes of the engagement processes that we've had over the last 5 years. And then I'll finish off very briefly with the challenges that we do face, both for this millennium, obviously with climate change, and PC, which is obviously post-COVID. It's a new acronym for now. So these are our strategies and plans that really underpin our work. And I think there's a couple of take-home messages that I want you to know. The first is we've done a significant shift from quite old sort of disaster risk reduction through to community disaster resilience. And in fact, even in the vision, I put the word disaster in brackets because anything we do to enhance community resilience is going to have a positive benefit for us during a disaster. So a lot of our work and time is integrated into wider engagement with communities, and I'll talk to that a bit in other slides. So the first thing is obviously our group plan, and that was back in 2015, and for us that was quite innovative for Aotearoa because it really it grabbed that word resilience and really tried to look at what that could look like for communities. And these are a list of our principles underneath that. And the one that I would that I've starred that I do want to draw out to your attention is it was about building these partnerships, but I really think over the years what we've learned and insight is whakawhanaungatanga is the #1 thing. Everything else falls out from that. And so making sure that there is the appropriate person and the time and the resources to really genuinely whakawhanaungatanga with those community groups and those leaders is going to pay dividends. It's not just a transactional interaction. Then in 2019, we had the National Disaster Resilience Strategy, and this is my Bible. This document sits in my desk at home. It sits with me on my desk at work. This underpins the vision for Aotearoa, and it's that we all have a role in creating a disaster resilient nation. So we all have it. And there are 5 objectives within that which underpin our community work. It's about Māori perspective and tikanga. It's about enabling that community level response, dealing with people who are disproportionately affected, looking at social connection, and then looking at our cultural and linguistic diversity, especially for us in Auckland, where obviously we have, I think it's the 5th largest cultural diversity in the world as a city. And then the last thing is Auckland's climate plan, which was earlier this year, I think. And again, the star on the mitigation point, I just really want to stress to you that the mitigation and adaptation are really two sides of the same coin, and the co-benefits that come out of the adaptation work that we do that feeds into the mitigation. It's almost like a closed swirling loop, and so we very much lean into that strategy as well. So this is the vision, and as I've mentioned, the word disaster is in brackets. But for us, with our lens as emergency management, the 4 points there are the things that we focus on. Understand that hazard, reduce where you can, prepare for what you can't reduce, so the impacts of that, and then have strong, positive and cooperative social connections. With the end goal being that in an emergency, people are able to come together and support each other. And you'll see this in some of the examples where this can work brilliantly. And the end result for us as first responders and a coordinating agency across the region is it takes the pressure off us, and it also empowers the community to take care of itself and its people. So it's a really, really important component, that social connection. So these are some of our engagement approaches. The collective impact approach is actually embedded in the National Disaster Resilience Strategy, and so often we are, the key point out in that approach is about having a backbone organisation. Sometimes it's us, and sometimes it is an organisation and community, but irrespective, that needs to be there. Dynamic adaptive pathway planning, which you'll all be familiar with, whilst we don't do that, for example, our coastal team is at the moment doing coastal adaptation plans. We dovetail into their work and provide a segment of that pathway planning and subject matter expertise. Human design thinking, obviously some of those really cool tools like empathy and ideate and co-design come through. IAP2, really important to understand the spectrum and where you have the greatest influence. So for us, we do not do the inform and the consult. That is broad scale, that's regional, it's our foundation. What my team does is the engage, the enable, which is often collaborate, and the empower. And we really focus on that deep dive into that with communities. And the tools that assist with that are obviously a lot of the behaviour change interventions that I'll touch on as we go through. And then the last thing, just to rattle the cages, I'm sure you know what the 4 R's are, the traditional 4. It can be your test. I won't tell you what they are. But we also draw on 4 more for here in Auckland. And those are reach, because we've got 1.5 million people. Relevance, again, because of the cultural diversity, English and, you know, the style of civil defence language may not be suitable. Receptiveness, go where the heat is, because I can tell you if it's not working, it's not working. The best time to do community engagement for us is obviously after an emergency, when people have it top of mind. And then the last thing is relationships, as I've said earlier. Whakawhanaungatanga is absolutely critical. So for those of you that don't have the joy of living locked down in Tamaki Makaurau at the moment, I've just put up a map to show you the communities that we've been working with over the last 5 years, and just so you get a sense of where they are in the lay of the land, in case you're not familiar with Auckland. So we've got the 3 West Coast beaches, Te Henga, Bethels, Piha and Karikari. Then we've got on the east side, we've got communities in sort of East Rodney on the coast and Whangapura, and then down here we've got Devonport, Takapuna. So from quite rural to sort of urban, and then very, very densely urban, and very different socioeconomic as well. And then we've got our 3 islands, so Great Barrier, and Waiheke, who would like to see themselves as standalone countries, and then Rakino as well, which has about 26 households. So again, we've got some real scale and demographic differences on our island communities. So I'm going to run through some of these communities. So the first 2 that I really want to touch on, and in a way they're almost like poster children. So Te Henga, Bethels and Karikari. And these are some of the qualities of coastal communities that lead towards very effective community engagement and community response in a coastal emergency. And that could be flood event, inundation, storm surge, or tsunami, or the ever creep of sea level rise. So critical to hear is that the backbone organisation is actually the community. They're highly organised, highly connected, and so some of those behaviours that we see coming out of those communities are obviously, they're very proactive. They are quite homogenous in terms of their demographics, so their cognitive fluency is very high. They have very simple plans. You know, Kari has a 6-page, Bethel's is a big A3, you know, really simple. So for us, our role, step aside. And that is a really, really finely tuned, finely working community for us who is able to deal with coastal impacts, and lots of community comms platforms, private ones, public ones as well. So we had, on top of COVID, we had a storm event in August, and Bethel's was significantly impacted. The 2 roads were very significantly damaged and they were isolated for a couple of weeks. They, as a community, fully led their response. And for us, as coordinating agencies, we just merely waited to hear what their need was and responded to that. So the last thing for those 2 communities to be aware of is then we have, I suppose, like design iteration, as I've said. After the event, people have dusted themselves off, we go back in and we have conversations. Okay, what could have been done differently from a response perspective? What do you need in terms of even enhancing the coastal resilience that you have? And that could be done by us, or it could be done by who knows, but at least having those ongoing loop conversations to be improving. I think rather than build back better, I think there's another expression, I can't think what it is, but it's definitely build back better. So hold those 2 communities in mind, because now I'm going to talk about Piha, and Piha is in the middle of those 2 on that west coast. We have tried numerous approaches to assist them to connect and grow their resilience to quite significant flood and coastal damage and risks that they face. And you can see the list down there. We've done the norms. This is what others do. Why don't you do it too? We've let others deliver the message. So we've used fire and emergency management, for example, and they actually even live in the community. So there's that concept of a trusted insider rather than someone like me who might wear the uniform of authority, but I'm not the trusted insider and have not lived there for 25 years. And then we've also got the dynamic of this divided community where we have the curse of knowledge. We have people who still hold to a very, very old style of civil defence that is not about community-led and community resilience. It's very much about individual and self-response. So we have a community that is struggling to find some common ground. As you can see, we've used multiple approaches around using different authority methods, different trusted messengers, all sorts of different engagement methods, both online, face-to-face, and 3 years on, we still don't have a resilience planning and integrated communities. So we'll keep trying, but it's just an example to show you how sometimes it can be very, very difficult, especially for small isolated communities or ones that have quite a range of socioeconomic as well, which Piha definitely does if you understand the demographics of it. So onto our islands, and again, a similar kind of story. We've got poster children, and then we've got ones with a bit of challenge. So Great Barrier and Waiheke. Great Barrier, if any of you know, is so resilient. It's you know, and they see themselves as a very, very closed unit. So we're not a backbone organisation, and for them and for Waiheke, we have set up and we support an emergency management committee. So they're almost like a mini version of ourselves run by volunteers and by agencies over there, and they really they've got the authority, they've got the uniforms, and we just step aside. And where need be, we can come in and provide some finances and support, but basically we are here to listen as and when they need. Waiheke, very similar, but again, there are some nuances around their 7 different villages, few nuances with elected members, but obviously those election cycles change, so that gives us new opportunities. Again, trying to use social norms, status quo, that we're doing this in other areas, it's working well, perhaps you want to consider it yourselves. And then a new thing on this slide, which is reciprocity. So we also have in our little toolkit a whole range of resources. I suppose you could call them incentives or the carrots, but they're things that enable a community to just get over the line and start to do resilience planning and forming their response to hazards at the coast. And then we have Rio Island, my island with 27 households. So their backbone organisation is a community one. However, as with Piha, there is community division quite starkly. And we have tried, as with Piha, using authority, using uniforms. So even I have a uniform and occasionally I put it on, but that has not been that effective. So at the moment, they have a planning process in place that's being led by some of the community. So we are looking at how that's going to unfold and how best to support a section of that community to bring in the rest of the community. At the moment, they're focusing on fire because that is the hot topic for them. But obviously water supply is also important, and sometimes we need to go in on a certain emergency hazard, and it allows us to open up to the wider hazard risks. So at the moment, obviously, sea level rise and tsunami aren't on the picture, but once we get through with the fire, then and the integration of the community as a whole, then we'll be able to spread out to the rest of the hazard risks for that island. And then if we flick across to the West Coast, again, a whole raft of community groups that are working, again, simple plans, simple actions, and we've been able to step back. But in this case, we are the backbone organisation. So what does that look like? That means going to their monthly meetings at 7 o'clock at night, way up, north. It's bringing resources, it's bringing money, and just being almost secretariat as well. But in order for them to get to a point where they can operationalise as a whole core of groups, that's what we're needing to do at the moment. And again, the same kind of things that I've mentioned before, that we've got the normalisation, other groups are doing this is what you need to be doing, best practice, and then the reciprocity as well, providing funding and resources. Now, Whangapura is the one which I've mentioned with the dynamic adaptive pathway planning. We're dovetailing in on our coastal team and their work around a coastal adaptation plan for Stanmore Bay. And again, we see our role as bringing our communities that we work with into a wider climate frame, because especially for a lot of people, climate change is still quite unknown, but emergency management isn't. And so if we can be part of the bridge between old school and civil defence and emergencies and bring people into the world of climate change and what that means in terms of sea level rise, increased frequency of severity, then we have a role to play. We also have a role to play in terms of giving people that immediate sense of control when they're faced with what climate change can be bringing to their communities. In Devonport Takapuna, again, this one's very similar, but the value here is that we have a region-wide organisation that is picking this up with local board funding, like $30,000, $20,000, significant funding. And this forms for us a model of a sort of a local board-wide approach to engaging, enabling and empowering communities. Obviously an emergency, but that can then go into the wider disaster resilience for coastal communities. So very quickly, these couple of slides are some of the challenges. So I'd like to thank Anne Patello, the policy, sorry, I can't see on my slide, and IAP2. These are engagement challenges, and I put them to you to be aware of them. They're almost like a think thing to take away. So trust is shaky, and I mean, we've seen that over the last 5 years, be that in America, be that with even our own engagement with information and online platforms. This information isn't to be trusted, this one is. So there's a lot of work to be done in that area around whakawhanaungatanga being trusted, and that your message is therefore trusted. Authenticity, I think the most important thing here is operating within the community over time. One of the biggest things I constantly have to me is, oh, you're still here. And it's like, yes, I am. And if I'm not here, then I will work with someone who's been in that community for 23 years. So really finding your partners, either within your organisation or within your community that you engage with, who have not only the cred, street cred, but also that alignment of values with the community and with what you're achieving. Not about me. So whakawhanaungatanga, but also that point about stepping back, stepping aside, leaving space for community to do what community does best. And then that local scale, and really stressing, especially for Auckland, you know, the diversity that we have, and really having inclusion in the processes that we do. So online, all of the distraction that's going online, and how you can at best engage for the best outcome for your project on when you're facing lots and lots of noise, and that is always going to be a challenge. And so these little pictures that you'll see on my slide, this is an example of live illustrators trying to capture information in a really visual and creative way to try and get that engagement. And then, I mean, today's the classic example. Here we are yet again doing a Zoom meeting instead of being able to meet face to face, but there we go. And really just finding that sweet point between face to face, online, together. How do we work it going forward so that we really get the best outcome for the project, and then the community capacity? And that's where I really mean about that backbone organisation. Be there, don't drop people down, but then also know when to step back and let community lead. So to finish, I know this is all about social, and I understand that I think all of you probably are more technical and technical based, but if this is in any way able to just give you a lens into that social world and that engagement that is needed so that you get the very best outcome from your projects. So, and I finish, and this is behaviour change for you, always finish on a good note. So I'd just like to show you this beautiful food and tell you why you need to do social engagement is because you get to eat the most fantastic food. So you need to do it. So that's me, and I'd now like to hand over to our next speaker. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Melanie. Let me just share my screen. Where am I? Right. Can everyone see my screen? Right. I really like your last quote, actually, that whatever problem, community is the answer, community is the solution. And always I believe on that your last mile should be the first mile. And that's why I think we wanted to listen from you, that you engage with the community, you try to discuss with them the problem, they will always come up with a many solution, and that could be affordable and more applicable for the community. So I'll be trying to go on the other ends, from the top down, that on the national scales, how we can actually measure our resilience, or what kind of framework that could be adopted to looking at this resilience aspect, because as you can see that there are so much diversity when you go to the community scale. And sorry, just as we're living in a community in a coast to coast, obviously you're quite exposed to various kind of hazard. And with the unpredictable nature of hazard and complication in the socioeconomic as well as technical systems, it's quite hard to often to analyze our climate change risk, disaster risk, as well as other related risk that among within the society. And also, as Melanie just presented, that the impacts varies from community to community because of their diverse diversity, livelihoods, their specific identity. They have a specific characteristics, and also a level of coping capacity or adaptive capacity. So staggering all this increased urbanization or changing the landscape, it has a quite mixed effect on our citizen well-being, environment, and economy, and which could give us quite challenging to rising our sustainability. And with the pandemic, it could bring more systemic cascading and compounding risk in our society, and as you can see already. So how we can actually create a resilience nation? So if we want to look at from the NEMA point of view, and also the Melanie just mentioned that one of the Bible is the National Disaster Resilience Strategy, which has 5 major objectives. But if you look at the objective number 5, which is like how we manage our risk, the enabling, empowering, as well as supporting community resilience is one of the main priority under the fifth objectives. And this priority was about to identifying, monitoring risk to the New Zealand well-being, taking action to reduce risk, ensuring the informative tools that are available to assist decision about resilience. But however, turning the resilience theory into practical action has until recently anyway been difficult to achieve. That has been mentioned by the paper. And you cannot actually manage what you cannot measure. So measuring the resilience through an indicator or some other quantification is quite important. So we need actually some tools or some guidebooks so that we can integrate all the frameworks and plans that exist within to measure our resilience. There are various frameworks exist, as you saw in the previous speaking, but also other than that, there are 4 capitals living standard frameworks. There are 6 sector national disaster resilience strategies. There are 6 resilience areas in EQC, resilience strategy for natural hazard risk reduction. Also, there are a guiding principle for Mataranga Maori and modeling interface. So looking at that angle, resilience in terms of natural, biological, technological, and man-made hazard need to be linked together. And also we need to find out how we can actually measure the community resilience through some indicator. So now, maybe before going back to the resilience framework, just going back a little bit in the past, actually how we evolve over the time frame, the resilience concept or the development through various campaigns. And if you look at our own kind of domain, like which is like human, natural environment, economy, built environment, and governance, the way we try to measure our resilience in Aotearoa, it has been quite evolving since after 2015, when all the global framework has been in place and the sustainability became a quite forefront, how we can actually incorporate the sustainability into the development process. And many of the country, many of the council actually, they're able to incorporate like UNDRR, Making City Resilience campaign like Queenstown as well as Tasman. There has been a Wellington as well as Christchurch. They adopted the Rockefeller Foundation 100 City Resilience. So all these frameworks is quite comprehensive. They talks about more or less 4 dimensions like health and well-being, economy, and society, infrastructure and environment, leadership and strategy, and also using various multiple, almost like 52 indicator they used in the in that one. But however, if you look at on a strength and weakness perspectives, you can see that various framework has their own strength. We just said there was a major talk about on a particular dimension, but moderately talk about such dimension like the sustainable development, the making city resilience, quite strongly focusing on all this dimension, but the built environment maybe moderately they try to look at, which was not quite strongly emphasized. And then if you look at globally, there are actually huge number of frameworks or plans or exist. And each of those frameworks has a different benchmarks indicator across the globes. And many of them failed because the key aspect is comprehensiveness, because as you can see that our community is quite diverse. It's quite difficult to making a one system could fit for all, or bringing one system that could actually fit for our purpose. So there is a lack of standard as well as in various frameworks. So if we just look at on that aspect, so we did develop a couple of frameworks back in 2004, which is called the Coastal Community Resilience Framework for Indian Ocean countries. And at that time, we tried to look at a thorough review on 150 benchmark indicator across institutional arrangement, policy and legislation, community and economy, coastal resource management, land use, infrastructure, climate change, and risk knowledge, emergency response, early warning systems, evacuation, disaster recovery and reconstruction, and monitoring and evaluation. And we put that framework as a benchmark. And then from 2007 onward up to 2020, we looked at almost 21 additional frameworks that has been adopted, applied, and used by various countries. And try to look at actually how those actually fit with those baseline 115 indicator. And while we reviewed that one, as you can see from the diagram, that there are actually some frameworks can capture only 0 to 40%, some captures 40 to 60%, some capture 60 to 80%, and some capture probably 80 to close to 100%. So there are numerous number of frameworks. So if we want to adopt something for our Aotearoa perspectives, we need to make sure that what is actually fit with our purpose, how we actually value those things, and how those indicators actually meet the requirement by the community. So it requires a quite evolving process and engagement to understand and identify all those indicators that need to be put in place. So we on that perspective, we try to distribute those 115 indicators into very generic way onto the 5 domain, looking at the coastal resilience guide as an integrated approach to coastal community resilience with support to development of coastal community and framework. And it's that all this generalized framework, generalized indicator actually we distributed onto the 5, but also put governance as a forefront so that it actually cross-cutting to all this particular domain. Some of the example, a good practice example that are currently ongoing is like Red Cross or IFRC flood resilience tools, which we try to apply, that has been applied in many countries, and we are currently trying to apply that for the flood resilience in Bapon and HKM area. Now, looking at the other aspects, so coastal community resilience is a need to be looked at more integrated approach. So where you looking at the capital, so we always look at 5 capital, but also there is a process and knowledge integrated with it. Often we actually try to miss or link to that knowledge as well as process into the systems. As you can see that there are and it could be located with multiple process, starting with transformative, adaptive, absorptive, anticipative, or preventive. What does it mean? Maybe I can just a little bit explain to you. The transformative, which is more talking about the capacity to create a fundamental new system based on the emerging issues that are actually we are facing. Probably that COVID could be a good example when the existing system cannot no longer function because of the ecological, economic, or social condition. in terms of adaptive process, we need to have the capacity to modify of change of characteristics as well as our behavior so that it could better cope up with our anticipated stresses that we face. And absorptive tips, I'd like to add maybe additional 4R, Melanie. You talked about 4 hours plus 4 hours, 8 hours, and I give another 4 to you, so which is mostly the robustness, redundancy, resourcefulness, and rapidity. So we can have actually multiple R's today if we want to discuss. So which actually prevent the functional level as well as achievability to cope and rebound our overall system. And then the third one is fourth one is the anticipative, which is actually capacity of forecasting and predictive what we're gonna face due to climate change or due to other kind of stresses. So looking at our knowledge hub, our early warning systems, our co-production as well as collaborative approach in the community as well as at the community scale, at the regional scale as well as the national scale. And then lastly, looking at the preventive measures, which is more on the how we are trying to find out the impact of an hazard, how we include those impact into our policy and plan, structural and governance, so that we are able to manage and reduce those hazard impact into our community. And the whole system needs to be binded with the governance structure throughout the process knowledge as well as domain systems. Finally, I'd just like to say the resilience need to be looked at more holistic, integrated, as well as cohesive, linking with disaster risk reduction, climate change adaptation, and as well as our development process. As we learn from our whakapapa that everything is actually interconnected. You cannot actually look at more isolation or in silos. Often our organization works quite silos, and I think that's quite creative, problematic when you want to measure something, there is a lack of data interoperability. But before going to the data interoperability, we actually need to talk about our institutional interoperability. We have the openness on our data structure, but we don't have much on the fairness of the data collection as well as integration process, so which need to be looked at quite carefully. Also, the evidence you maybe saw 3 weeks back, there was a report actually published by the Auditor General in the report of the government preparedness to implement the Sustainable Development Goal, which clearly mentioned that there is a lack of measuring the community resilience as well as Sustainable Development Goal. And Auditor General Ryan also quite highly emphasized that how we can actually improve our data collection process through the STAT New Zealand or also other organizations so that we can work as a coherent manner to make sure that there is a data ecosystem in place to measuring our resilience. So the community resilience guide could allow the key to ingredient of resilience, which could be effectively and efficiently achieve our increasing vulnerable communities. And that's the way we can also achieve our national strategy that we have to building a sort of coastal community resilience and how to measure and understand where we are at now, what is our weakness, and what is our strength, and how we can actually reduce our weakness and making us more resilient in that perspectives. I think that's basically my talk. Happy to answer any question and comments that you may have.
We haven't had anything pop up in the chat yet, but if anybody does have any questions on either of those, then yeah, take yourself off mute, or you can jump in the chat to add some questions there. Yeah, that's really fascinating. Yeah, thinking about the bigger picture of climate change and hearing that word resilience. And Melanie, your sort of scale of resilience in different communities and the variety that there is even across the Auckland region. I hadn't appreciated that contrast that you've got between the rural sort of communities and then obviously your metro community as well. So that must really present
brings unique challenges.
Yeah.
I mean, as Auckland is quite big comparing to any other council, and you can see quite diverseness. And I think obviously that is quite challenging, as you saw from the Melanie's presentation, that each of those areas has a unique problem, unique characteristics, and how you actually bring those things to fit to the purpose.
Emma, did you want to ask a question? I see you popping on.
Yeah, I was just going to ask, thank you both for really interesting presentations. Kind of a out of the box question, but with working with those different communities and seeing how they had different approaches, or you had different success with sort of setting up something in those different communities, did each of those communities have a different view of what resilience meant to them?
Resilience is a word that has only recently come into our vernacular outside of the health sphere. And so when we did our group plan in 2015, that was quite revolutionary, even for central government. And then we had the 2019 National Disaster Resilience Strategy. So I have to say, it's only been a word that's come into our sphere and into everyday vernacular relatively recently. And so the communities that we've been working with, and credit to them, they've always known they live in a hazard risk area. I mean, I think we all do, because we live in New Zealand, don't we? It doesn't matter where you live, you're going to have earthquakes or something, or significant weather events for us up here. So I think it's more about how easily those communities who've been very old school around just civil defence response with baked beans and look after yourself have felt able to let go, connect, and look at the wider picture of resilience in its entirety. And then it's also for people who've never thought about civil defence, the ease with which and the comfort with which they can just step straight into resilience and see a place for themselves, and for that word to encompass them, their whānau, their street, and what that might look like, not just for civil defence, but for, you know, eco-restoration or placemaking. And I think this is where the future lies, and it's certainly something that we do, is we're constantly looking for those leverage points where we are not front and foremost. We come in with others, and this becomes mainstream. It's just something you do, like clean your teeth. You know, you've thought about what your risks are, how to mitigate them, know your neighbours, you know, all that kind of stuff. Yeah, that's my perspective anyway. Bapon, do you agree?
Yeah, I fully agree. And also, I mean, as you just mentioned, actually, so you work on the civil defense, but when you're talking about resilience, it's not only civil defense. Actually, you have to also looking at other arms that within the council and how actually work together hand in hand to better understand, because the coastal development infrastructure, which is also part of resilience, but maybe you are not looking those things, but those need to be work hand in hand, understanding each other. So it's a collaborative environment is quite important in this case.
Definitely.
We have one more question from Chris. What tools do you deploy to enable difficult conversations? So one for Melanie, among communities, and for me, across the discipline expert silos, particularly to discuss climate change and adaptation and manage retreat. When is the right time to have this conversation, and do you have threshold and tipping point in mind? I can just go maybe first, and then Melanie, you can jump in. Thanks, Chris, for the very, very good question, actually. I mean, I see most of the cases, actually, we are quite reactive sometimes, because unless something happens, we don't actually jump into that kind of situation that, okay, what would be the managed retreat, how we actually solve this problem. So it's triggered with an event, and then we say, okay, in the news you see that, okay, it says, this is a wake-up call, this is a surprise, but these are not actually surprise. Any disaster that happen or any event that happen in our New Zealand, you may see there is a history. You may face that maybe 10 years back, 15 years back, 20 years back, but that has a nature, that has some characteristics. If we analyze those things, we could actually better prepare ourselves. So we need to be a little bit proactive and also responsible and custodian who actually need to be take those lead. That also quite biggest issue here. Because our institution, as I said, works quite silos. Who gonna take the lead to managing that huge database? Who gonna be the custodian for that? Because data often stuck with a local council or regional council, and that actually doesn't transmit to the central government level. And there is no such kind of mechanism that you have a portal which can actually build on all this database into a stack, and everyone can access it, use it in a different purpose to understand their assessment kind of things. And obviously you can always put those kind of threshold for various hazard. What does it means to particular community, a low, moderate, and high kind of scale, and obviously it will vary to community, but that required to better understand your hazard profile. So once you have a good hazard profile, that may lead you to understand your vulnerability as well as a risk ranking, and then from there you look at the consequences, and then followed by more adaptation options or response option.
Thank you. They're very good questions. I would agree that with climate change, that lens is still relatively new for our communities and who we rub up with. And the good thing is for Tamaki Makaurau, we've now got our climate action plan and stemming and budget for it as well, which is very important. Stemming from that now, I'm involved with like adaptation targets that are being set. Driving out of that will then be the initiatives that enable us to meet the adaptive targets. There's also local climate plans that are being developed for non-Aucklanders. We've got 21 local boards. So there is a strategy in place to begin to work with the willing local boards and develop these climate action plans, of which the mitigation and the adaptation comes in. And back to Bapon's point before, the integration meetings that we have across the Auckland Council operations around all our different siloed works, how that comes together into one to form a climate action for that rohi moving forward. So we're still on that journey, but I think it's setting in place the strategy, the frame, the process, and we'll get there. We also have to be mindful of the RMA reforms that are going on as well when we're talking about climate change, adaptation, and especially the coastal frame as well. In terms of the difficult conversations, I just refer back to my slide about the approaches and really stress probably three things. Making sure we have that collective impact and have that backbone organisation, ourselves or a community. Then looking at human-centred design processes, so, and then through that process using some of the nudges or the behaviour changes. And at the moment, that seems to be the best nuanced way to have these conversations. And then unfortunately, we have the card up our sleeve, which is when the next event happens, then we may be able to get further traction, and a difficult conversation may open up into something where there's more space to move forward. Yeah.
Yeah, one more question, Melanie, for you. Which of the coastal communities you mentioned would be the most ready to have this conversation, and how would you start?
So these conversations, right, the adaptation managed retreats and tipping points. Yeah. We are working closely with our coastal team because this is such a difficult conversation to have with communities when we don't have central government leadership. So I refer back to that RMA reform work that's underway. So until we have some very clear guidance from central government, we've seen from other local councils the complexities and the difficulties of having those conversations with communities that are at the forefront, and you only have to look at the Hawke's Bay or Kapiti or South Dunedin. So we are following our coastal team and supporting them to have those beginning conversations around coastal adaptation planning, and what are those values and what gets protected, what's retreated, and how that happens and who pays for it. So it's still very new for us here in Auckland, I'd say.
Well, we'd like to hand you back, Ophelia. Yeah, over to you, Emma.
So those places that you listed, are they top of mind because of most recent events?
They are top of mind because council assets are there, so we're looking after ourselves first, and those assets have immense value for the community. So you could say it's the safest sand pitch to be playing in, because we're not talking about residential homes like if you've been looking over in New South Wales, who are right on the beach and are spending $300,000 each to build a 7-metre tall fence along the beach to protect their properties. So we're working with that slice of the coastal pie.
Makes sense. Excellent. Do we have any other questions? There's nothing else that's come up in the chat. No. Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Bapon and Melanie, for your time and sharing your expertise with us today. Yeah, it's absolutely fascinating, and I think there's just been this massive shift in consciousness generally around, you know, we've had, especially in New Zealand, earthquakes and yeah, all sorts of flooding events. So I think there's a lot more social awareness and thinking about that resilience with disaster. I liked the bracketed disaster there, Melanie, about being prepared and having that resilience before we're in the event. Yeah, but the last 10 years I think has certainly seen a sort of a social shift, and I'm sure that will continue as people talk about climate change and the impact that we're all going to be seeing in the coming years. Yeah. Excellent. Thank you so much. Yeah, and I'll just take this opportunity to remind everyone that we do have more webinars coming up, and we have several events in the coming weeks as well. We actually have the Water Asset Management Forum coming up in Wellington on the 17th and 18th of November, and our annual conference, which has been shifted due to COVID, shifted to February. So do jump onto our website for all the other events that we are hosting and our future webinars. We'll also be sharing the recording of this webinar and publishing that on our website with the slides. So thank you so much, everybody. And especially for your time, our experts, Melanie and Bapon.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.